Hi, welcome back to Down and Scaled Replicas. Thank you so much for joining me for this final Workbench update in this series where I've been developing a 1/1000 scale Federation Class Dreadnought and then a detail set for Polar Light's 1/1000 scale USS Enterprise kit. So it's good to finally see all of these wrapping up and coming together. I always love to see a project come together and be completed at the very end. One more thing I'm going to walk through is a display base I've been working on. Now remember, I've been working on an adapter and display base, which I've made available on my website for these kits to replace, if you have the older kits, this kind of rinky-dink plastic display stand that was initially released with these kits way back when they first came out. I've got this, but one other thing I've been working on, and now this is just for myself, is something a little bit more elaborate for displaying this series of kits that I've been working on, both the Constitution class kit as well as that Federation class Dreadnought. And so I'm going to walk you through the details of how I've been building this. Now, this is just for myself, but as I walk you through the details, you'll see how I've done this, and maybe you can do something similar for some of your model kits as well, too. I kind of think it's turned out pretty well overall, and I just wanted to show you how then I pulled that together. So thank you so much for joining me for this series of 3 Workbench updates. Please be sure to subscribe so that you know when the next series of Workbench updates drop. And so let's just get right on over to the Workbench and get these projects wrapped up. As I mentioned earlier, I left those 2 lower warp pylons off until after I painted everything. So now it's time to go ahead and get them installed. Now, this is a really nice tight fit here in these slots. I don't know that you necessarily need to use glue. I went ahead and put some epoxy glue into here anyway. So now I've got to make sure we got the right pylon here that's going to fit into here. They are handed. Make sure you've got a nacelle pointing out. That's going to join with the nacelles. Just slide them over the brass rods then, and then it's going to be a tight fit into that slot. But go ahead and work it and get it down in there, and you want to get it to the point where almost that first grill down there is touching the surface of that secondary hole. Not quite, but pretty close. Going to be a nice tight fit. Really, you're not going to have a gap there that you need to worry about addressing with filler or sandpaper or anything like that. And then turning to the saucer section, getting that mounted onto the secondary hole. Again, I'm going to use epoxy glue here. You do need to use some glue in this area here just to make sure that these parts are fixed together permanently. But get the epoxy glue in there. Do some test fitting ahead of time. I've seen that over time the resin perhaps, I don't know if it expands a little bit or what, but that fit there can be a little bit tighter maybe than you want it to be, so just use file and sandpaper to get it to where you're comfortable with it, and then get those 2 parts put together. You can see I'm just making sure that they're firmly put together there. There's not going to be a gap or anything that you need to worry about filling here, and that's why I've waited until everything is painted before putting these 2 parts together. Time for the details, and it's the end caps here. I'm going to break them off of those toothpick holders there. That is not a mating surface there in the center, so I'm not worried about that stub of the toothpick remaining there. I'm going to go ahead and just use CA glue on this. I don't think I need the strength of epoxy necessarily. And again, there's going to be a tab there just to make sure that everything gets aligned then with the warp nacelle, and get those guys put into there. They should fit pretty well, and just hold them for a few seconds before that CA glue sets up. And it's the same story for the DSR domes as well too. I've already got some CA glue on the front end of the warp nacelle, and now just fit the dome in there. There is a central key on that DSR dome that makes sure that you get that symmetrically aligned, just perfectly centered on the front end of that warp nacelle. Hold it for a few seconds until the CA glue sets up, and you're good to go. We haven't looked at those navigational deflector dishes yet. So they come in 2 parts, the dish itself plus the spike in the middle. I've used some all-clad copper on the dishes themselves, and then I used some bronze, if I recall correctly, on the spike. And the spike is just going to fit down into the center of the dish. There's a little bit of a ledge there on the spike that is going to act as a stop for the dish. What I do is I'll pull them together like this, and then I'll just put a spot of CA glue on the back end to hold them together. Once you've got both the front and the aft deflector dishes ready to go. Do a lot of test fitting here. Just make sure that those slots that they're going to slide into are open enough for you. I twist it just a little bit as I seat it in there, and you know, once you get those guys in there, that's pretty much going to wrap it up for you. And another one in the books, and I'm really happy to finally be here. It took a lot longer to get here than I had originally anticipated because I kept going back and tweaking the design. As I built the prototype, there were things coming together that I just didn't like the way they were fitting or the way that they ended up looking once they were done. But with all of that tweaking, I'm really happy with the end result now, and I think that it looks the way that I wanted it to look, and it comes together and assembles the way I wanted it to assemble. In particular, I'm happy with the way that that revised impulse deck looks on the back end of the saucer, and I'm happy with having the bridge on the top of the saucer section so that it's more consistent with other original series era kits that we've seen. The display base I have painted here in nice bright colors, and I think it really complements well the model itself and will really make it stand out among other Star Trek models that you may have on the shelf or on the contest table. Overall, the kit really has the look of the Dreadnought that I set out to recreate when I started this, and I'm very happy with what I ended up with, and I appreciate you sticking with me through this part of the build. To me, putting the decals on the kit is when the kit really comes alive and has a lot more detail and color than it had before. And so for me, that's the reason that this part of the process is really fun. You can see I put down the micro scale set product first to help prepare the surface for the decal. I lay down the decal, and then I'll use micro sol after that. I'm using a combination of my own custom decals as well as the decals out of the Polar Lights kit. I have to do some of my own custom decals so that I can have the USS Constitution registry and name on the kit, but other than that, I pretty much ended up using the kit decals for everything else. And you can see how I'm really being careful to try to get the location of the pinstripes on the nacelles equal between the port and starboard sides. Here you can see that combination of my own custom registry, the NCC 1700, but then the kit decals for the windows there that I'm putting the micro sol product on right now, as well as some of the other details that you see there on the lower saucer. Now, unfortunately, one of the things that can really make a decal session frustrating is when the kit decals just aren't working out very well for you. And of the decals I did use, about half of them broke apart. And you can see I'm struggling with that right now on one of the decals for the tops of the saucer. I don't know why I had so much problem with these decals. They are a little old. It could be a quality issue with the decals themselves. I don't know. I didn't put anything like a decal clear coat on top of the decal sheet before I used them. Maybe in future I need to do that. I've seen some reviews online where the Polar Lights decals just seem to have this problem of breaking apart as you put them on. So maybe it wasn't just me, or maybe it wasn't just these set of decals. I don't know. Either way, what I might say is when you're building this kit, if you haven't already used the decals in the past, you might try putting them in some kind of inconspicuous area first just to see how they behave and see if you have as much trouble as I had with them breaking up. I finally did get everything aligned and put together more or less the way I liked it, but it was a bit of a struggle, and it kind of makes for a frustrating and unpleasant session, unfortunately. With decals wrapped up, I added another clear gloss coat on top of the decals, and now it's time to finally assemble the warp nacelles onto the pylons. And you can see there's a little bit of brass rod still sticking out of the pylons there. That's going to fit into a slot on the warp nacelles, and just push them onto there. Be very careful not to break the pylons as you do it. It's going to be a tight fit, intentionally so. But once you've done that, they fit in there. Just double check that everything is level, and the kit is finally starting to come together. And I've also left the end caps off the warp nacelles up to this point because I've been putting a rod into the warp nacelles to support them as I painted everything. Just a few drops of CA glue in there, and you'll see that there's a notch that helps you properly align the end caps with the warp nacelles. Just get those guys on there, and that's just about going to wrap things up. And here is the completed kit. I've got it mounted on a special display stand, which I do make available with an adapter for the Polar Lights kit if you want to try a different display stand. It's unfortunate those decals kind of moderated my enjoyment of the build of the kit overall. That's unfortunate. But, you know, I'm really happy with the additional detail now on the warp nacelles as well as the grids on the pylons. And overall, I'm really happy with the way that it came out. Thank you so much for following along on the build of this kit. If you want more information on these warp nacelles or the display stand, please visit the website downunscaledreplicas.com. And in the meantime, happy modeling. A side project I took on was building some custom wooden display bases for both the heavy cruiser as well as the dreadnought, because, you know, I just don't have enough to do already. It's just a hunk of wood is all it is that I have stained black, and I put some feet on the bottom that you can see there, and I've got some custom 3D printed decorations on the top, so we'll walk through that. Like I said, it's just a hunk of wood. I've cut to size. I have mitered the corners there. And then I've put a display rod in the middle of it. And you can see the bottom is kind of ugly, but you're never going to see the bottom. And then on the top there, I've 3D printed and then painted these decorations. So it's the pennant like you see on the side of the hull on the starship. And one is going to fit over that display rod and sort of establish where everything else fits. And you can see the rest of them all kind of fit together like puzzle pieces there. And I'll walk through that in more detail. To get everything as straight as I can on the hunk of wood, I've got a T-squared set on there, and that's going to establish the straight line for these parts that are going to go on there. Now, I apply just a bit of epoxy glue to the back side of these parts, and I will start with the part that goes on over the display rod there. I then follow that with the back end of that pennant, and I use this spacer piece there just to give me a spacing that's uniform between those two parts. While the 5-minute epoxy sets up, I'm going to put some weights on the top, but to avoid damaging the painted parts, I've got this little piece of plastic that's going to go in there between the two. And so I have these metal weights that I'm going to put on there, and I'm going to put a wooden block on here first just to direct the weight onto the part a little bit better. That metal piece wasn't balancing on there correctly, but I'm going to leave these on there for about an hour or two while the epoxy sets up, and then I'll come back and finish up the rest of the details. Those two parts are well attached to the base. Now the front two parts here, this yellow swoosh as well as the red part in front of it, they just kind of fit in like puzzle pieces now at this point. So I've got epoxy glue on there, and I'm just going to fit them into place, and I will put weights on these parts then as well. In Star Trek, the original series, every individual ship had its own unique emblem that the crew wore on their shirts. Now, since the Dreadnought, the USS Federation, is non-canon, I just made one up using the United Federation of Planets flag, thinking that this is the Federation, so that might be their logo. You can see I was a little messy with the glue there. Unfortunately, I got that wiped off. You can still see a little bit of that there. I'll get that cleaned up more so later. But I've got this on here now, and I just tack it down gently with a couple pieces of tape while I wait for that 5-minute epoxy to set up. Moving on to the front of the display base, I have a dedication plaque or commissioning plaque that's going to go on that, and I'm actually going to screw that down using some brass screws that I'm shown here. These are wood screws here, and they're relatively small. These are number 2s that I'm using, but I've sized the holes in the corners of the dedication plaque to take those screws. So I drill some pilot holes in the wooden base. I got everything lined up, and then this is actually what is going to hold that 3D printed and painted dedication plaque on the front of the display base. And so now I've got something a little bit different, a little bit unique to display both the heavy cruiser as well as the Dreadnought, kind of set them apart from some of the other models that I have on my display shelf. And I really like the way that they turned out to be very colorful as well as three-dimensional for displaying these ships. Again, I really appreciate your time and patience following along with these builds here. If you've enjoyed them, please subscribe to the channel. And if you want more information both on the Dreadnought as well as the Warp nacelle detail set for the heavy cruiser, please visit my website, downinscaledreplicas.com. And in the meantime, happy modeling.